Discover how you can green your life by building a knowledge base of current sustainable and eco-savvy trends. This series will delve into hot topics, current standards and practices, ways to design better spaces, and specify materials that benefit not only us as consumers, but the world as a whole. Members of Green, as sustainable materials distributors, and other industry leaders weigh in throughout the series. This is Build Green, Live Green. Hi, this is Jessica with Build Green, Live Green, the Green podcast on sustainable building materials and how you are impacted by building materials and industry issues. And today we are talking about one of those industry issues with Matt Bodoff of INEOS Composites. Hey, Matt.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Happy to have you. We are talking about one of the biggest issues in building materials today, and it's about to hit home. And when I say home, I mean, homeowners and us individuals as well. So your background in INEOS Composites used to be with Ashland, who was purchased by INEOS, but INEOS is one of the biggest, chemical suppliers, in the world, I guess. And you guys have been impacted by a lot of different things in the supply chain, and you found yourself incredibly close to the supply chain issue. And there's my dog. You found yourself incredibly close to the supply chain issue, and consequently have sort of become the voice in the industry in a lot of different ways for what's happening. So, can you tell us a little bit about kind of how you got to INEOS, and then also just sort of introduce and start talking about the supply chain issues that building materials are facing, and why prices are going up on a daily basis, sometimes a semi-daily basis?
Sure. So I've been in the composites industry, which is basically the polyester resin industry, my entire career. And over the last few years, when I came to Ashland, I was the global business development manager for our engineered stone business. My job was to run around the world working with quartz manufacturers and solid surface manufacturers, helping them with new technology development and pricing and supply chain. And with the recent INEOS acquisition, it's given us a pretty interesting look at the broader supply chain, because INEOS is both a large manufacturer of the base petrochemicals that go into making so many of these raw materials, as well as the manufacturer for polyester resins, which then go into producing a lot of these surfacing materials. And it's really given us kind of a unique view of not just what affects us as a company, but it affects our suppliers through our competitors, and then our customers, and ultimately the end of the supply chain. And I think through the work I've been doing with ISFA, the industry association, it's been great to to really see how at different levels in the supply chain people are affected, and who hasn't felt the effects yet and probably will over the next few months.
Yeah, so you mentioned ISFA, and ISFA, for our listeners, is the International Surface Fabricators Association, and your connection to them is through quartz countertops, which are probably one of the most popular types of countertops right now, have kind of taken over from granite. And that's how we're connected, because Green's a surfacing supplier, and you're an expert in this. Some of the base materials that go into it, whether everything from pigments actually to some of the resins and so on. So and one of the things I think people don't understand is that petrochemicals go into everything, right? They push their way through the supply chain. It's not just surfacing. We're kind of the early impacted, I would say. We're some of the earliest impacts. The downstream impact of this on consumer goods and household items is going to be a pretty big deal. So can you talk about all of the things that happened? Right now we're seeing, just so we can kind of set the stage, lumber prices are through the roof. Fiberglass insulation is on allocation. A lot of PVC-based materials are on allocation. Resins for almost everything, and resin is basically anything plastic, is on allocation. Force majeure has been claimed in many cases, or enacted. Surcharges are hitting everything, and in building materials, prices are just skyrocketing. And it was a compounding of issues. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those issues were?
Yeah, so I think this actually goes back starting in kind of March, April of 2020, at the height of the COVID pandemic, when manufacturing around the world sort of ground to a halt. And as the commerce started to recover from that COVID situation, the demand recovered much faster than the manufacturing capabilities were ready to match. So you had a very strong demand coming out in the summer of last year, but you still had factories around the world in all sorts of industries in the, whether it's petrochemicals or building supplies, that they were having a hard time keeping up due to employee shortages or outbreaks that would cause them to start production and stop production. So you already started having through the middle end of 2020 this supply demand imbalance. And then typically the chemical industry tends to see a slow period coming into the fall and winter, right? It's the holiday season. You don't see a lot of outdoor projects being done across most of North America. But in fact, we saw quite the opposite last year, whereas the demand for all these base chemicals was extremely high going into the winter. And so it kind of compounded this supply demand imbalance. And then in February of 2021, we had Winter Storm Uri in Texas, which basically took about 80 to 85% of the country's petrochemical capacity offline for a good 4 to 6 weeks. And this affects so many things, not just our surfacing world, but this affects everything that these chemicals go into. So all the different products that are made out of plastic, everything from packaging to toys to food handling, and then obviously what we care about is the surfacing materials. And the ultimate effect of that storm is now they're saying about 5 billion pounds of plastic production was taken out of the supply chain for that 4 to 6 week period. And even though
Wow.
the storm seemed
5
like
billion?
5 billion, yeah. And that's just a number that the industry can't just immediately, when everything comes back to life, immediately produce and fill the supply chain. There's this kind of delayed effect as production slowly ramps up as these factories come back online.
Yeah, so so you've talked about a few different things here. We've had the petrochemicals were most severely impacted by those storms, but even leading up to it, in late 2020, there were a couple factories that have gone offline, basically had incidents or explosions, in Asia that had already started to kind of hinder some of the production, right?
Yeah, so there was a major liquid epoxy manufacturer in Asia that had a industrial accident that took one of the largest global suppliers offline. And what that did is it forced a lot of pressure on the domestic suppliers. And this is epoxy resin that goes into things like adhesives, into some resins for production. And that led to two things. Not only did it lead to product shortages, but it led to this what became a very rapid rise in pricing. And mainly because those imported products were used as a bit of a buffer to the domestic supply. So the domestic suppliers kept their prices at a reasonable market level because there was that threat of import competition. And as soon as that threat
Hmm.
went away because there wasn't enough import capacity, pricing started rising dramatically. And the price of liquid epoxy since the fall has gone up now almost 40%, because it continues to climb. And the way a lot of the supply chain works is when the base petrochemicals are affected, it takes a few months for the people who transform those, people like Ineos Composites or the adhesive manufacturers, to feel the effects of those. And then it takes a few months longer for our customers, the distributors, and to feel that effect. So it may not be another, 4 to 5 months before the end individual consumer sees the effects of something that happened in February at Home Depot or Lowe's.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because I was on the phone earlier, actually yesterday, and I was talking to one of our salespeople, and I was um, talking about some of the supply disruption, and she was mentioning that she could not find cat food, and I thought, well, that's ridiculous. Why can't you find cat food? And it's starting to get there. So the cat food plant in Texas, I believe, I think it was somewhere in that area, um, was impacted by the storm. But it's also the bags that the cat food goes in, that plastic. They can't get that material. So I'm smiling because we're on camera, but it's not funny. Like it's not an enjoyable situation. And I think that everyone's going to get impacted. So from what you're saying so far, so the supply chain issues, the contributions have been this kind of post-COVID recovery where things have restarted. The chemical industry was impacted by these plant disruptions as well as the storm, which further disrupted these domestic plants, the international plants and the domestic plants. Um, then COVID itself impacted the ports where there were massive COVID outbreaks at the ports and the people there that couldn't work and unload the containers. And then you have an issue with the containers, right? Because there's this glut of full containers trying to get into port while you're trying to order containers from somewhere else, but there's no empty containers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Exactly. So it started again at the with the COVID shutdown in kind of April and May of last year. There's this delicate global balance of the big cargo ships and their containers. That these things are constantly moving around the world from port to port on a fairly fixed schedule. And so what you had was this period of 2 months when global commerce kind of careened to a halt. And then as it came back to life, these ships and all of their empty containers were in the wrong locations. And it takes months for that to get reset. And in that period, you also had the slowdowns at the port of LA to where ships were getting backed up. What would normally take 2 weeks to unload, we're now pushing 6 weeks. And that affects the importers and distributors who rely on those timely deliveries to fill their supply chain. And so you saw massive stockouts of a variety of products, everything from these building materials to just the simple stuff, like you said, like cat litter or toilet paper, things we take for granted when you go to the stores. If they can't come into the country and then there's not enough trucks domestically to pick them up at point A and move them to point B, it creates real shortages. In the chemical
So,
world, it's a real problem, the trucking, because there's not enough actual drivers to fill all the need for deliveries.
yeah, and so you had mentioned to me in a prior discussion that delivery drivers, they the delivery drivers required for chemicals, they're hazmat trucks. And when everyone kind of got relegated to home, people got real comfortable ordering online, and the amount of Amazon deliveries and grocery deliveries and cold food, like Whole Foods and Blue Apron, that type of food delivery, all of those became in much more demand. So there's demand for more drivers. So why drive a hazmat truck when you can, drive an Amazon or another type of delivery truck?
Exactly. I mean, unfortunately, the truck, long haul truck driving is a bit of an aging industry. There's not a lot of new young entrants to the market to fill the demand, and so the highly skilled drivers are out there looking at, well, I can make the same amount of money driving for Amazon or Walmart and be home with my family every night and only drive a short distance around my distribution warehouse, or I could drive these hazardous petrochemicals, thousands of miles across the road and have to deal with the loading and the unloading of that, and it's an easy choice for them. And so what it's led to is about for every three petrochemical hazmat deliveries that need to happen in North America, there's only one driver available. So scheduling your deliveries now is a feat of, it's almost a miracle to get things scheduled and the trucks to show up on time.
Yeah, wow. So, so we've talked about, all these things compounding. You've got the supply disruptions due to chemicals. You've got this post-COVID recovery. You've got this labor shortage. You've got this shipping issue. These, factory incidents. There's also increased demand in other countries who are also recovering, but may have been sources of some of these materials, and now they're consuming them on their own. So this is kind of a perfect storm of all those things that have just gone wrong. And as prices continue to climb, companies like mine, which have, sustainable materials, we're fighting about pricing anyway because we're trying to say use this, it's better, it's a better solution. Um, but maybe it costs a little bit more, but it's better than this for you and for the planet. Now that little bit more cost is even larger, and there may not be money left over for those types of products if the base building costs have just grown exponentially.
Yeah, I think you have two separate, you have this kind of supply issue and this pricing issue that are going to affect the consumers in different ways because as you mentioned, when the supply is of basic materials that go into building everything from boats and RVs to homes, when they're in short supply, these companies are forced to source whatever they can to keep production running. And oftentimes those are at higher prices. And sooner or later, those prices have to get passed on to the end consumer. And then on top of that, I think pricing in general, even when the supply situations kind of even out, pricing is going to remain at elevated levels. The White House just released their annual inflation guide, and they're saying that we're in this period of hyperinflation right now that they do expect to stick around for a few months before market prices ease
Mhm.
back down. And ultimately, that means
These
is it will be then 3 to 4 months after that before the consumers are affected.
So if you were to give advice, and I say this because on LinkedIn, you see me posting about these supply issues because I'm kind of fascinated by them. But I think it's a strategic time for companies to really make the best moves that they can make, knowing what's coming. So this is not the time to turn a blind eye to this issue and think it's not going to affect me. And I know a lot of companies are going to do that. So we've done things internally to make sure we're going to have materials available when people ask. Are we going to have everything? No, but we're going to have a program in place to, provide substitutions when that makes sense. Um, but we're also going to over communicate with our suppliers and just say, hey, here's what's coming. I've had people calling me for months saying, FYI, FYI, FYI. So when I get their price increase, I'm not blindsided, right? I'm placing orders knowing that I'm going to need, if I place them now, I'm going to get a better price than I am down the road. So my suggestion to people in the building materials industry is don't turn a blind eye. And as you've suggested multiple times, don't be afraid to raise pricing and protect yourself as well. Plan ahead and make sure that you're going to have solutions. You don't have to have the perfect solution, but you should have a solution. And now is the time for products like mine. You never heard of paper stone, you've never heard of Durat. Well, these are great surfacing alternatives to the quartz that you can't get right now. So I'm positioning us to have those conversations as a building material supplier. What additional advice do you have for building material supplier and also for consumers? Like if you're talking to your best friend from college and they say, yeah, I'm building a new house. What advice do you kind of give the consumer to safeguard themselves against some of these supply chain issues that are coming?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is to watch their budget and to make sure that what they if they started working with a contractor or a designer at the end of last year or in the fall, and now they're just getting into starting that project, make sure that budget is still good and the prices, especially if they're doing kind of a cost plus, on raw materials, make sure those numbers are still in
Mhm.
line with what they had budgeted. And that goes back to your point about communication. Talk to your contractor about what they can get their hands on. You don't want them tearing out your sink in your kitchen only to find that they can't get the new appliances that you've been waiting for or the new flooring that you've been waiting for. Now you're stuck with a kind of in construction project for 6 months. And
Yeah,
I
I
think the
kind of
other
think
thing
of
is
it makes
be
me think of,
open.
no, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I think the other big thing is be flexible, be open to alternatives if you can't get your first choice on things. And we're seeing it with our customers when it comes time to getting the resins they need, but I think it really does trickle down to the consumer. If they can't get the number one choice, like you said, if they can't get quartz, look at these alternative materials because very often they'll find that hey, maybe something they didn't consider before is now all of a sudden a little more price competitive, or because it's more available, it's more attractive for their project.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's two things here. I see this as an opportunity to introduce brands and products that people aren't familiar with. Maybe because they're made in the USA and you can get them now. Maybe because someone has stock of them or they planned for this issue. But I think it really is a unique opportunity potentially to introduce some of these products. The other thing I would caution is don't bet on it being a recurring thing. So don't bet on because just because someone ordered, 2 truckloads of this in March and April, don't expect them to order it in May when they can get the cheaper stuff again, or it's not going to be May, but say it's, later in the year. But don't bank on these orders for some of these new materials or alternative materials, unless you have a really good value proposition that you can convince them of after the fact. Because right now it's a lead time issue. Lead times are massively increasing, and we've had, every day someone comes to us and they were like, "What do you have?" So
Yeah.
it's a unique time in the industry, and I'm eager to keep an eye on it. I wouldn't say excited. I'm eager to keep an eye on it and just try to keep people informed. I think we can both do that and try to protect as many of our kind of colleagues in this industry and the companies that we care so much about, and inform them to make good decisions so that they can make their way through this supply issue.
Yeah, I think, if we look forward, 6 months or so, I think there will be some positives that come out of this. And if we try and focus on those, it makes it a little easier. But if one thing we're seeing, especially in our world, in the surfacing world, and in general in all building products, is coming out of the COVID pandemic, people have taken a new look at what materials they put into their houses. And I think that's going to drive some changes in our industry that are long overdue, where people are going to look towards more made in the USA products, as you mentioned, or more sustainable products, better for the environment. Because I think people are realizing now that the cost and energy involved you know, on making something, halfway around the world and now getting it and having it sit on a ship at a port, just sitting idle for a while, isn't necessarily the best use of our resources.
Right.
And I think things will get better. We're seeing the supply slowly start to ease up, and eventually prices will level down and we'll get back to some level of normality. So the key is people just have to be patient and not kind of freak out, which is hard not to do when it's your home and you're desperate for
Yeah.
that color or that countertop you've always wanted.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye on it, and if this persists, we'll do a second round of this discussion a little bit later on. Thanks for joining today, Matt.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Jessica.
This is Build Green, Live Green.